Our juggernaut record, though, comes from Lamb of God and Omens, which was released last week. It's been quite cool seeing people's reactions to it. In a way, you could say that this feels like a slightly less important album than anything Lamb of God have released in a while for kind of, I guess, their overall health or trajectory, in that Sturm und Drang obviously came after such a turbulent period for the band personally. Then they had a 5-year gap into the self-titled, which saw the band having to prove themselves with a shifting lineup. Omens comes just 2 years after that. You could see as the band just kind of continuing to deliver what they promised now with that record. And does this album essentially deliver exactly what you expected? Yes. The interesting thing there, though, is that in the entire decade of the 2010s, we got 2 Lamb of God albums. In the 2020s thus far, we already have 2 Lamb of God albums. Just as a little precursor to what we might think of Omens, what would you guys rather have? Less Lamb of God albums that take a little while longer to gestate and have more wide-reaching ramifications for the state or the sound of the band, or for them to get more on the treadmill of kind of producing reliable work?
I would rather take the sort of fewer albums that are a bit more experimental, a bit more interesting, and not just kind of like churning out the sort of the Lamb of God sound at this point, because Sturm und Drang is still by far my favourite Lamb of God albums of the last couple of records because of, like, I think the interesting ideas that makes. That said, I am just happy to have new Lamb of God.
I'm going to take the opposite position, but I do agree that I would prefer Lamb of God to be more experimental and a bit more adventurous with their sound. My contention is they had 5 years between Sturm und Drang and the self-titled, and the self-titled might be their most perfunctory, unambitious album so far.
I think the lineup change kind of maybe had more to do with that.
Yeah, that obviously is an important factor and something that we have to consider when weighing those albums up. But I would say that I expected, at least from the last album, for them to, as you say, try new things, and Sturm und Drang seemed to point in that direction. But when that album came out, it seemed very like four on the floor, reliable groove metal, which, you know, not many bands can do as well as Lamb of God. But if I'm going to wait 5 years, I would hope for something very experimental and very ambitious rather than just Lamb of God by numbers. So if that's the choice, I'd rather have it sooner than later.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't necessarily surprise me that this record and the self-titled have come closer together than anything else in recent memory for them, because they do seem a bit less like they're shooting for the stars and more them becoming one of the reliables. Where the self-titled album, I mean, it had its huge fans. I don't want to say that like we weren't fans either, because I think, you know, we are, but like all of us hold it in the lower esteem of what they've made because it was more basic, wasn't it? I mean, Elliot, what would you say it was about the self-titled that just made it not bad, but just lower tier Lamb of God?
It was the first time that I think Lamb of God sounded like they were aging, which isn't necessarily a problem. You know, they aged fairly gracefully. I didn't think they sounded old or sounded old hat or anything like that. But it sounded like there was less fire in the belly, they were less willing to try new things, and they were sort of, they knew, it was like they were doing an album in the Lamb of God vein, rather than Lamb of God making an album that they wanted to make. And I'm not saying they didn't want to make the self-titled album, but it sounded like they were performing to a formula ever so slightly. And I'm not criticising them too much, because most bands of a certain vintage end up falling into that trap, if you can call it a trap. But for me, that made it really the first time where I wasn't excited by a Lamb of God album, because even the two albums previous, which are, as you say, held in slightly lower esteem than the glory run of the first 5, I think those sounded like they were experimenting a bit. They were sort of putting their toe down a few paths, thinking of where they could go next. And so when the self-title came out and didn't really explore any of those things, for me it sort of felt like a slight redundancy in the catalogue.
Yeah, I think for me, like, Resurrection Man, Memento Mori are great, Checkmate's good. The rest of that album, I can't say I've thought about or remembered all that much in the time since I last listened to it, even though I'm sure they're good, right? They're just not songs that need to stick around for them. I will say that in 2022, around the release of this album, I have been listening to more and thinking more about Lamb of God than around the release of the self-titled. Part of that is seeing them live again at Bloodstock, at which I will say Memento Mori opening the set, seeing that live finally, because again they hadn't come over here since the release, was fucking massive and made me love the song even more. In there, we also got Nevermore and Omens, which are already songs pretty much as good as that, and I think you can see across those, no, Lamb of God, no matter where they are at in their career, they can fire out a banger on demand, because, God, they're fucking great, aren't they? Nevermore's opening riff, like lumbering into life, is so sick, and it's technical for something so groovy as well, which I think is the thing that loads of Lamb of God clones can't quite do. How swaggering Nevermore is while being quite complicated. And then when that gets used as the basis for that, hanging by your thread, fucking huge. And that as a single did put itself right in my head. That, Lamb of God, righteous party metal, chanting something fucking rad, sells it so well. And the riff getting laid out at the end is just fucking heavy. And then Omens, maybe even more of an earworm.
Nevermore, just the fucking choke on it, like...
Yeah.
Randy Blythe can just, drop a line, and he sounds really fired up on this. But Omens is one that I'm just like, that is a timeless Lamb of God song in the way, and that it is just full on rowdy, fiery, raging groove metal, but with, like I say, a party vibe to it at the same time. It's just everything that you want Lamb of God to do, really massive, rousing, shouting on chorus of "fuck it all, ignore the omens,"
Yeah,
so
I think that Bloodstock show was the second time I'd ever heard that song. But the bounce on that, and that, oh man, just fucking, it's so much fun. Just, grim, fuck you, spit in your eye, Virginian muscle, fun. Which they do really, really well. And it has that chugging turn in the second half, which feels like a brick wall hitting you. Really fucking good. So they are still absolutely so capable of going by the way, here's a couple of the most fucking just satisfying metal bangers you could ask to hear out of anything that's going on. I think Omens as an album maybe delivers slightly more in the kind of that department overall than we got last time out, which I think is something the reaction to this album seems to have been very, very positive. And I think while I don't think this is a straight fucking back to the 2000s years or whatever, I think there are things that this does that improve upon the template.
Yeah, there's enough here to really sink your teeth into. The 1-2 of Ditch into Omens is just you want just hard Lamb of God, just bangers. That's what I think. It's still, like I say, feels a little bit I don't want to say going through the motions, because I think they are in on this. They are fired up, and I think Randy I think this sounds more alive than I think the last album did to me. It's got a bit more fire in it, and I think that goes a long way.
See, for me, comparing this to the last album, which it sounds like we're all doing, and I mean, for me, this album is more characterized by peaks and troughs than the last album.
Okay.
I think the self-titled starts really strong, Memento Mori, all-time Lamb of God classic at this point, and the last song, Off the Hook, On the Hook, I can't remember which one it is now, but both of those I thought were excellent, and everything in the middle sort of merges together. This, for me, is great songs peppered with sort of, as we said, Lamb of God by numbers, slightly more perfunctory stuff. But when it's good, it's, for me, the best they've been since Wrath. So this is a very pleasant surprise in my book.
Okay. I think those sort of maybe perfunctory songs, they're less peppered across the record, and maybe more just, I think it starts really, really strong because it opens with Nevermore. Vanishing is, again, if I'm saying there's something that Nevermore does that their imitators don't really do, Lamb of God don't only do, Southern groove. They do quite menacing and quite epic in scope sometimes. And Vanishing has that in the riff, in the way that only they write. This strange blend of kind of thrash metal, 90s melodeath. The bridge on that is the most early 2000s metalcore they've sounded since Palace's Burn. Yeah. And it has a real element of pace on it. There are a couple of moments on this where I go, as much as I've gone, Lamb of God are great, but they don't quite sound like a young, hungry band anymore. When they clench the fist and properly go for it on this, it makes you go oh, man, they can still bring it. Because, maybe whether that's the kind of further gelling of the rhythm section here on this one, it's not quite as bare as the self-titled felt, which had this kind of really 4/4, almost punk style slamming to it. But it's not got the really fluid agility of Chris Adler either, which is the thing that's missing. It's sort of between the two, moving forward from the self-titled. I think To the Grave is a song where the drumming does feel quite simple and standard for kind of, if you look at how that thing would have been once. Listen to the footwork on there, and it's so just bass drum here. There's no nowhere near that agility. And I think you can definitely hear there maybe what feels lazier about the band than if you were to get that same riff on, Wrath or whatever. But it's certainly steady, and I think it's upping the kind of the venom that they have on this one. I mean, in that song as well, the post-chorus riff that Randy brings in with a "to the grave eternally," like fucking rocks.
Yeah, I mean, when they really lay into a riff on this album, like they do for that opening riff on Vanishing, and where the pace is there, I mean that makes them feel a little bit more dynamic to me than because again there were moments of that on the last album where they would go into the more thrashy stuff and it was going to go, oh yeah, they're really hitting it there, but it felt a bit more spread out, whereas this kind of feels a little bit more like you're getting the faster stuff, you're getting the big slamming grooves, you're getting stuff with a little bit more epic scope, like Gomorrah kind of has, like in the sort of darker elements, and it feels a bit more involving, even if it's not completely I'd still would like more interesting sort of deviations, like I say, Ivory Oak, Sturm and Drang, but if they're not going to do that, at least this is a bit more involving.
Yeah, the one for me where I felt the most like, oh fuck, this does feel like it has the intensity that I once felt, and the idea. Mechanism. Well, no, I'm going to get to that later, but I mean, okay. Just of the more standard Lamb of God songs, the one where I just felt that real fucking like rush, and the idea of saying it wasn't as heavy or whatever felt a bit silly, was Ditch, because that song goes and that feels white knuckle.
That's my favourite song on the record. Like, I think that song is just killer. And like I said, like pairing that with Omens is just that 1-2 of like, oh, I want to swing a fist right now.
Well, I would say I agree. Ditch and Gomorrah are my two highlights. And Gomorrah, I think, is interesting because it does the menacing, slightly glacial Lamb of God.
Yeah.
I mean, glacial by Lamb of God standards, But Ditch is maybe the most successful they've been since possibly Wrath. At that, completely no frills, super menacing, as you say, white knuckle, all power, groove metal. And that is one of the songs where Randy sounds particularly fired up. I think he sounds great across this record, but that song on the chorus, he sounds so commanding and, imperious. It's so infectious.
Yeah, I mean, when he opens with the "I don't give a goddamn," and it just goes, like, the small matter of Randy Blythe on that song is fucking, that chorus is like such catnip for Lamb of God fans. It pops off so far hard just from the kind of gritted teeth conviction of it. Like you do not want to be the guy who he is singing about on Ditch, because he sounds like he fucking hates you. And I think if you look at, if there's one member of Lamb of God who isn't slowing down whatsoever, that's Randy Blythe. Like, more and more as sort of the records go on, he is like the MVP of this record. I mean, the little coda of Vanishing, which is maybe a little jarring when it comes in, but he on it with that "never to be seen again," like, fucking is so huge. He really, like, Randy Blythe can make you feel like you are listening to Lamb of God, like the younger band, because he attacks it so venomously. For me, I think the second half is where it falls into some of the maybe like solid but a bit forgettable Lamb of God songs. So for me, it's the run of Gomorrah, Ill Designs, and Grayscale, which are solid, just not demanding there to be in setlist anytime soon. Gomorrah has that like big "everything is doomed to fail" hook, which is good. It almost feels like a hook that's been in like a dozen other Lamb of God songs up to that point. But if it ain't broke, apparently Grayscale was released as a late single like a month ago, which I'm very surprised by, because Vanishing or Ditch on here or even Gomorrah are much catchier.
Yeah, Ill Designs and Grayscale are the two I kind of like. Like, they are the album tracks. I'm just like, they're there to sort of fill out the runtime. They're not bad. They are.
No, they're fine, but I could not sing those ones to you right now the way I can the highlights on this record.
Again, like, I can just any line from Ditch, they're "live or die, doubt." Like, there's nothing of that caliber on those two.
I think it's quite interesting now that the Lamb of God records that we were receiving 10 years ago, or just under, feel a lot more divisive in the discussion around their experimentation. Like, we are saying that we enjoyed that. There were a lot of people who didn't really take to what was going on those records. And I think Resolution as a whole is the one that I think has the most left turns of all their albums, from like, sort of that weird sludge intro all the way through to King Me. And then Sturm and Drang had like the big Overlord moment that everyone sort of threw their toys at the pram about. Those records maybe felt like Lamb of God were getting ready to move past the kind of stock template of what their sound is. And then in the 20s, they've doubled down into it in their like most basic form again. And I guess that this goes back to the question posed at the beginning of kind of which you would prefer of those things. There's a tiny little bit of clean singing in Nevermore that is so minimal you could almost like blink and miss it compared to the likes of like Overlord or King Me. I think the last two songs on it are the sort of, you know, the toe dips of experimentation that we have on this one. Denial Mechanism is the one of those two that seems to have really gotten people like excited. For me, it's good, but they'd already mastered that particular song with an album track on Resolution called Cheated that everyone seems to have forgotten about and overlooked. A 2-minute incredible Lamb of God hardcore punk track is not unwelcome, don't get it wrong, but it's not new either.
Yeah, no. I was like, I was just sort of really thrilled when that came in after the sort of the two lesser songs, and I was like, oh, here we go. Like, they are just raging for 2.5 minutes. Awesome. But I do agree, it's not totally. I mean, you can just go back to like the Burn the Priest sort of like stuff, and like
it's a great song, and I'm glad it's here because it's definitely you're not going to forget that one the way you might Ill Designs or whatever. But I don't think it's like pushing the boat out. September Song is the one that is a bit more, you know, adventurous, and it has a minute at the start of it of threatening to be a kind of closer in the vein of something like King Me or something, or, you know, Reclamation from Wrath, that are so massively distinct in their catalogue. And then it kind of becomes a bit more familiar.
Yeah, I think that was my problem as well. I mean, talking about these last two songs, Denial Mechanism, as you say, I think they did a better job on Cheated. And also, I don't think this punk thing, I know Randy, he openly says, I'm not really a metalhead, I mostly like punk music. I don't think that sort of thing is Lamb of God playing to their strengths. And so that was a bit of an issue for me, was thinking, you know, you're such a sidewindy technical band. It seems a bit like you're underplaying by playing something a bit more rudimentary.
I think that's true,
floor.
But I think it's valuable to have it on the album because it doesn't just become another Lamb of God song, you know? I think it's good for the dynamics of the record to have something like that.
Well, see, this is what I was... Then when September Song came in, and that first minute, as you say, was so different, you're expecting something sort of, as you say, more experimental, a bit more adventurous. And then for it to go back into a Lamb of God song afterwards, it was like, no, this was you were now going down a road, which was fairly new, and then you've sort of backtracked at the last minute. And it's not a bad song at all. Like, for me, it's still one of the album highlights.
I think it's still... There is still some interesting stuff going on there in terms of, like, the structuring is a little bit weirder. There's a sort of, like, slightly proggy element to it. Yeah. And also, I like the kind of faint choral effect that's going on. Like, it's, you know... Pump that up a bit, I reckon, in sort of excess. But I think it's just the last two songs are really good in what they do, and they're good songs on the record. But if you put it in the context of things they've done in the past, they do feel more like baby steps than what they've already mastered. You know?
Yeah, no, I think September Song is good. Again, like, I like the strings being in there, but it doesn't. It's the one song I feel like they could have gone further on the record, like, because it's the one where they do kind of tease experimentation, and it just doesn't quite fully realise it, but it's still, you know, a grand sort of larger closing song.
One of the most curious things about this album is the way they've been talking in the press about how this is the most boundary-pushing Lamb of God album yet, and every song has its own identity. And listening to it, you think, there's flickers of that. There's times you hint at that in songs, but you don't always fully realise it. And that's not necessarily a problem, but it is slightly concerning that Lamb of God think this is their most boundary-pushing album. You think, I don't know if you're the best assessors of your own work here.
Yeah, they've made that record, and it was called Resolution. Yeah. Like it's very bizarre that they've done weirder things than this, but then treat this as like something that is stranger than it is. But for me, again, I feel like I've been negative there when I didn't actually mean to. I actually came into this record, this review, quite buoyed by it, because I think the last two songs, while baby steps of experimentation, they are very strong in what they are trying to do. For me, then you add that great run of like 5 or 6 songs at the start there. I think it's really good. Like, I think I'm slightly surprised pleasantly by how much I like this record. Like, it's not to the point of putting them like in, you know, the upper echelon of what I'm the most excited about again. Like, this isn't going to be in my top 20 at the end of the year or anything. But it's closer to that than they were last time.
Yeah, no, I am pretty much on the exact same level as that, where, like, I'm way more interested in the last album. I'm still not totally like, Lamb of God are back, they're awesome. But there's enough here for me to go, like, that song, like
Yeah.
Ditch, Omens, I want those to be live set mainstays.
You are having so much fun for like most of this album. It's just how it is.
Well, this is it. I think it's a substantial improvement on the last album. When I got to the end of the self-title, I thought, that was fine. I don't think I'll ever listen to that again in full. Whereas this, you know, in the last week I've listened to it a couple times, and as you say, there's songs that I'm really looking forward to seeing in the live set and hope to see in the live set, which I didn't really have outside of Memento Mori. I didn't really have much on the last album where I thought, I'd trade in some songs that I'm used to seeing from Lamb of God in favour of these new ones. Whereas now, there's, I'd say about half this album I'd happily see slotted into those, you know, maybe even replacing mainstays.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I wouldn't put it any further than above the self-titled myself. I did find their more ambitious 2010s work more rewarding, but this sounds like Lamb of God, you know, entering their 50s now, being pretty fired up with that. And there are still parts of this, like Nevermore or Ditch or whatever, where it still feels like it's showing some newer bands how it's done for this kind of metal. So I'm in a good Lamb of God mood around this record.
And also, I think it's healthy to maintain perspective on this sort of thing, where I think now people expect bands to be brilliant for longer, or maybe, you know, they talk about things like Megadeth and Metallica and the greats and say, oh, they had those great 5 albums at the beginning, and then if it went a bit rough afterwards, that doesn't really matter. And then yet new bands or more recent bands, they hold them up to a much higher standard. But you think, what was Metallica's ninth album? Death Magnetic. Megadeth's ninth album, I'm not sure, Risk or World Needs a Hero, that sort of thing. This is to a standard beyond those things, in my opinion. So I think it's 9 albums in. I have very few complaints.
Yeah, I'm pretty pleased with it. Omens by Lamb of God.